Hey, everybody, guess what? Here you are. You are here with us in the Nature Journal Educators Forum. If that's where you wanted to be today, you are in exactly the right place. This is a very exciting day today. We're going to hear about some original research on nature journaling with our special guest today, Lindi Shepard. Lindi, thank you so much for being with us. Hooray.
Thank you.
We also have some group announcements. There's some cool things going on in the wide world of nature journaling these days. Evea, could you let us know what is happening?
Absolutely. It's good to see everybody. First, I'm going to announce that in, I guess, a week's time or something like that, a little bit more than a week's time, International Nature Journaling Week 2023 is beginning, led by the incredible Bethan Burton, and featuring the theme of sensory safari. Let's see here. There's probably more going on. I'm putting up the, I apologize for my multitasking. Here is the community calendar. There we go. Sorry. There's a lot of events starting to come up on the Wild Wonder Foundation website. So if you go, then you'll see that it's filling up. And last but not least, before I pass it to Lindi Shepard, I want to congratulate Billie Jo Reed for an award that she got recently. And I'll let you tell us a bit more about your award, Billie Jo. But we just all want to say that you so deserve that recognition and more, and we're cheering you on. So please tell us about the award.
This was not my choice to talk about this. This is everybody else within the green room, but I do appreciate it. So thank you. Every year there is awards of distinction given out at the Peel District School Board. And this year I was nominated for one of those awards by some kindergarten teachers at Ridgeview Public School that I had been doing quite a bit of work with this entire year and throughout COVID. So they were kind and nominated me for that award. So that was really nice. So that's what happened. Thank you to everybody. I'm very embarrassed right now.
We made the Canadian blush. That's good. That's good. Well, hey, thank you everyone for being here. As we mentioned earlier, this is a really exciting day today because we are going to, there's sort of nature journaling as sort of the thing that it seems to be evolving into is it's an old phenomenon, but this new incarnation of it is a kind of a new thing. And it's being picked up in schools and educational settings. But there's little known about the impact of this kind of journaling on people who participate in it. And that is something, part of that sort of knowledge void is what Lindi Shepard has stepped into. Lindi, we're delighted to have you here. Maybe just start by telling us a little bit about kind of your path, your interest, and how you got here.
Okay, thank you. I'm so excited. So I was a classroom teacher for about 16 years, and that's kind of my background, where I come from. And I was always super interested in how we learn and kind of the brain science part of that. And so, I really got interested in kind of this space between research of the learning sciences and then practice and what we're actually doing in our classroom and like how those things are linked. And there is a pretty well known, for those of you in either the practitioner side, the research side, or those of you who operate in both, there's a pretty well known gap between those things that often exists where, when you get really into your research, and I understand it, you like get into this mode and you're in academia and you're conducting studies in the field or maybe in a lab, and really seeing like how people are learning, or maybe you're going into the neuroscience of how learning works. Maybe you're kind of remaining in more cognitive science and psychology, and then you're publishing papers, and those papers are getting into the hands of your colleagues, and they're getting really excited, and then you're, you know, talking to more people who are in psychology, and it gets to be this like really enclosed bubble. And sometimes it's hard to get that to spill over into practice. And then the practitioner side of that, I've seen that too. And you are in your classroom and you're doing the things and you're looking for tools that you can actually be using. And do you have time, or do you even have access to get into the databases to read all these like heady journal articles about the science of learning? There's just a chasm between these two things. And the more I've gotten into the research side of it, the more I'll say shocked and sometimes exhausted, frustrated I get when I just see how much research is out there on like every topic imaginable. It's like, it blows my mind every time I think I have an original idea. I like go out there and it's like, oh, this has been a body of work for 50 years with, you know, hundreds of thousands of published papers on it. But like, where was that when I was a teacher and I was interested in that, you know? And like, how come I never heard about this line of research that was happening? So I think that's really interesting. And then I think what else is really interesting is, despite the fact that there is this massive compendium of knowledge about how we learn, like Jack was saying in the introduction, there actually isn't that much about like specifically nature journaling, or as I call it sometimes, scientific field sketching. Kind of use those interchangeably a little bit when I'm talking about what practitioners are doing. So if you're with high school kids and you're out and you're using it in a science class, you might call it, you know, scientific field sketching. To me, they're interchangeable for the purpose of my research. So I've gotten really interested in kind of thinking about how we can kind of highlight different processes that are happening cognitively when kids, when adults, when people are using this tool, how they are using that tool, how it's being used in classrooms. I have some new research that I'll be doing this summer that's actually looking at like how skills that are picked up through nature journaling can transfer to other domains outside of the natural sciences. So I'm really excited about that one. You know, yeah. So really exciting things are happening. And yes, transfer of skills. So this research is just like an itty bitty bite into, you know, a little dip of the toe into the river of where some of this could go. I wrote this particular paper. It is not published anywhere. It was just for a class that I was taking. The class is called Development of Creativity. And so I decided kind of early on, we were going to do this like big kind of research project as our final. I decided that I wanted to focus on nature journaling or scientific field sketching. And I know that, you know, this has been used to kind of bridge between science and writing, science and art, science and, you know, a couple of these other domains. And to me, I was like, oh, the mixture of that could be a really interesting way to study creativity. A lot of people think of creativity, they think of the arts, they think of music, they think of poetry, they think of a painting. And some people have trouble seeing how creativity might be evidenced in science. And so I thought this would be just a really interesting way to study the bridge between creativity and science. And so that is why I chose to focus on nature journaling in this particular research. So I'll tell you a little bit about the methods that I used and the frameworks I used to analyze the data and findings, and a few things that didn't make it into my paper, and a bit about why I think it matters. But before we get into all of that, I also wanted to kind of start by just like getting our own juices flowing about this topic. So I have a question for you. I'm going to put it in the chat, and then let's all just take like 2 minutes to write about it, to draw about it, to do whatever you want to do to kind of express this on your own and kind of get your head into this space of creativity. Here's the question in the chat. How do you define creativity? How do you define creativity? And I'll keep my eye on the clock. All right, start wrapping up your thoughts. If you'd like to put anything in the chat that you were thinking about, we'd love to see it. But it's a big question, and creativity, as I've definitely found out in this class that I took, is very difficult to define. It's very difficult to define in research, especially when you're trying to be like somewhat objective about things or nail things down to specifics. It can be a little bit fluid and difficult to name. So yeah, thank you guys for adding those. All right, so for this study, I interviewed 4 naturalists who all use field journaling as a part of their practice. And I used 2 different interview protocols. One of them already exists in the world. It's called the Views of Nature of Science, the VNOS interview. And that kind of gets at like, how do we think about the nature of science? How do we understand the domain of science? That was definitely something that I was interested in. And then I also created additional interview questions that were a little bit more specific to nature journaling. And I was really trying to figure out how to assess like the context and the purpose of field journal use and the role that this tool played in participants' identity formation. I also collected samples of participants' field journals, and I analyzed the pages kind of alongside their interviews to get this holistic qualitative picture of how participants were using field journals and how it was impacting their understanding of science as a domain. I also administered, it's called the 5DCM. It's the 5 dimensions of curiosity measure. I had some interesting findings, but of course, like n equals 4, they're not, significant in any way, but they were definitely, they piqued my curiosity for how that could be looked at in a future study. None of that made it into my paper, but I can tell you a little bit about it later on. And I thought it would be interesting for us to kind of get involved right into the research ourselves. So I did this interview protocol. So I'm actually going to give you one of the questions from the VNOS. And I thought it would be fun to go into breakout rooms and interview each other. So I was thinking just small breakout rooms, maybe 2 participants in each, and you could just do a back and forth, or 3 could also work. So whatever you guys think is best. And then what I'll do is I'll stick the question in the chat. This is a real question from the VNOS interview. And I'd like you guys to ask each other this question, and maybe we'll do about like 6 minutes or so. Does that sound about right? Okay. All right, here's the question. How are science and art similar, and how are they different? How are science and art similar, and how are they different? All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some really interesting conversations. I love this question. I could talk about it for days. Oh, I'm glad you thought it was fun. I really enjoyed also as just a part of my research being able to hear about how different naturalists thought about this question as well. That was really special for me. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I analyzed the data that I collected. So I essentially did what you guys just did. I interviewed different naturalists and I asked them questions about the nature of science, like, is there a place for creativity in science? Or what's the difference between a theory and a law? Can theories change? There's all these different questions that kind of get at how science works and how we think about how science works. And then also those questions more about how they use nature journaling in their lives. And so I looked at all of this interview data together. I looked at the pages of their journal, and then I used two different theoretical frameworks. So these are, just works by different people who say, this is one way to kind of view your data. And the first theoretical framework that I applied is called the framework of participatory creativity. This was, I can even put it in the chat. Let's see, the framework of participatory, there we go, creativity. That's something that you can look up. It's out there. It is one of many frameworks or ways of understanding creativity that I happen to really like when I explored it. We've got all different ways of viewing creativity, from psychometrics, which is like, how much of a divergent thinker are you? How many ways can you come up with for using a brick that other people can't think of, right? So that's one way of thinking of creativity. And participatory creativity takes a different approach. It really looks at, like, how are you participating within your socio-historical context of, like, all of your community and all of your ancestors and all of the material world and the challenges and affordances that provides as well. So it was developed as kind of this amalgamation of different understandings of creativity through the years. A classic view of creativity, and I think this came up in my breakout room just now, is that creativity could be viewed as something that's just innate. Like, you're kind of born with it, or you're not. You're a highly creative person, or not really. You have it or you don't, right? The all or nothing approach. And this was actually really the most popular way of understanding creativity for a very long time. And it's kind of exemplified by, like, the genius paradigm, right? So you've got these, like, highly creative people. And, like, if we're thinking about in science, you might think about, like, these major scientific advancements that you learned about in school. You're going to think about the people who were credited with those advancements. So you'll think about, like, Watson and Crick and Einstein and Darwin. And you might say, well, that person was just incredibly creative. So they were able to see something that nobody else was and really put it all together. All of the guys, all of the white guys. And yes, exactly. And you might say, well, I couldn't do something like that because I'm not a creative genius, right? So participatory creativity, well, first, let's take the example of Darwin, actually. Let's dive in there, because I think that's a really good example, because he used scientific field sketching famously on the HMS Beagle. He made these beautiful sketches and, like, really used those in his development of the theory of natural selection. And so we might look at what he did there and say, okay, field journaling for him was a real tool that he used in his creative process as this highly creative, highly intelligent person. Yes, his barnacle drawings. Exactly. Yeah, and still today, creativity researchers use those journals and like analyze them and look at them for examples of how his creative process unfolded. So that's like a really famous example. However, if we're viewing creativity through the lens of sociocultural participation, so participatory creativity, then we actually kind of back away from that genius paradigm a little bit and say, well, what was the historical context that Darwin was operating in? What were the social contexts? Who was operating alongside him at the same time, maybe developing a very similar theory? For those of you that have studied some of that, that was also going on. We can think about like the zeitgeist, right? Like sometimes the same idea pops up in multiple places along the earth at around the same time, just because maybe the environment is ripe for that. Maybe we have the tools to examine something at this point in time. And so multiple people will make kind of similar discoveries around the same time. But we also see that, you know, folks like Watson and Crick, they didn't operate in a vacuum. Like they were really building on many other people's work, many other tools that were being developed at that time. And so they happened to come along with the right idea in the right moment. And we're part of this kind of larger process of participation. So by viewing creativity in this way, we can really see how all creative works, from like these revolutionary achievements to just everyday choices that we're making, contribute to cultural progress, move the meter along a little bit. So it's critical to acknowledge that in any field, in this case, I'm looking at the field of that naturalists are operating in. And a lot of people would say this is not just one field, but many, right? Because naturalists tend to operate in multiple different fields and kind of combine different fields. So it's somewhat ill-defined, which also makes it very interesting as a field. It's very important for us to think about this being shaped by not only these big names like Darwin, but also the everyday people who are doing this work out in the field and then communicating it within smaller communities. And those communities are communicating it to other larger communities and networks. And this is what actually builds a field of study. And so I was really able to see this evident in the 4 nature journalers and their pages that I looked at. I really saw how they played an integral part in influencing the direction of their field, and also how this practice really influenced them. So I looked at their work through this lens, and I found a couple of really interesting things. One is that I found that they were being creative with their dealing with the constraints of field work. So one of the things that I thought was really cool, and we've talked about this in here, is the use of biometrics. So you're out in the field, you can only bring so much with you as far as instruments or measurement tools, or maybe you just pull out your journal and you weren't expecting to nature journal in this moment, but you see something really interesting and you really want to capture data about it, but you don't have your measuring stick and you don't have, you know, different things that you might have used otherwise to capture all of that precise data. So what do? You might turn to biometrics, right? Well, I saw evidence for, in one of the journals, at least, somebody was trying to measure, I think it was the tide, and they were measuring like the distance between the tide and a particular part of the shore, because they were trying to capture runoff of the sand and something like that, like I think a restorative practice for the seagrasses and the dunes. And in measuring this, they used biometrics. They walked with their paces through the sand to get to the shoreline, and they captured that. What I thought was really interesting, though, so we've all heard about using biometrics because we talk about it in here a little bit, but this person said, oh my gosh, when I'm walking over here on this part of the sandy beach, the sand is really compacted. And so my pace is, you know, my normal pace. But then when I walk over here, actually the sand is really loose and like mucky, and I'm sinking more and I'm working harder to walk. And so that actually might impact the length of my pace, right? So, this tool that we are all using as a cultural practice within field journaling, we may need to account for walking along different substrates, right? So they posed that question in their journal. Now, when we think about like using our nature journals or our field journals, we might be thinking about it more as like a personal practice. Like, I'm just recording this because I want to know it. You might be working in, you know, some kind of field where you're sharing that data. But often it is just for me to remember the thing that I saw. So I'm going to go look at it later, and, you know, gather that data and keep that data and compare it next time. And so it's kind of for me. But when that person made that discovery about their pace changing depending on the substrate, if that person were to, you know, let's say participate in a study of nature journaling, and then that person who studied them was to, you know, talk about it in a room full of nature journalers, hypothetically, then all of a sudden everybody in that community is now thinking in terms of how pace can be impacted by the substrate that you're walking on, and they all may modify their future practices based on this new information. And so by capturing that question, this person was actually changing a practice that's common in the field. And so this is kind of the way that field practices even come about in the first place. And it's the way that they are improved over time. And so one element of creativity that I saw was really the journaler asking themselves the question, but also this element of sharing that came up, and sharing in a social community and improving practices for everybody who is to come. So I thought that was really interesting. Creating new roles, I also thought was really interesting. So yes, we have kind of this role that we give ourselves as a naturalist. We head out, we learn about nature, we might teach about nature. All of the folks that I interviewed had roles as well as teachers in some capacity. And I think it's really interesting that there is this role of a nature journaling educator. That I don't think existed, I don't know, 10 years ago. I don't think that was a job that I've ever heard of. And it's, you know, it's kind of a job now, but it's like just evolving. And we're all building that. We're all creating that together. And so when you are using your journal as an educator and you're thinking, how am I going to teach this when I get to my classroom? Or what would I do differently? Or, oh, I really want to bring this example in, or whatever it is, you're actually creating the field of nature journaling education. It's a really generative kind of process. And so that was one way that I found that journalers were being creative. Also creating community and creating different avenues for sharing their practice, like the one that we're in right now. And then a big one was in creating confidence in themselves as practitioners, whether that be in themselves as practitioners, as scientists, or as practitioners, as educators. They move as practitioners, as naturalists. They move through several different spaces and different titles, but it was really clear to me that the practices that they were using when they were doing this practice of scientific field sketching was helping them build their identity within these roles. That brings me to the second framework that I used to analyze the data, which comes from Bateson in her Composing a Life Story, which talks about kind of these multiple identities that we construct over time about who we are in relation to others, our own identities. And it talks about how that might change depending on the audience that you're talking to, depending on the room that you're in, depending on how you are reflecting on different experiences in your life, with hindsight, and then again with hindsight, and then again with more hindsight. And so these things your identity really changes a lot. It morphs and evolves a lot over time. And you can also hold more than one identity at a time. These people identified as naturalists, they identified as scientists, they identified as educators, they identified as parents, they identified as community members. So they had all these different identities, and nature journaling played slightly different roles depending on what those identities were in helping them create that identity. I think one was as a major one was just in confidence in themselves as naturalists. And I think this is really important because, like I talked about a little bit earlier, the field in which naturalists operate is kind of fluid. It contains bits of geology and bits of orthogonography and bits of mycology and bits of, all these different fields and ecology. There's so many different things that are considered when you consider yourself a naturalist. And then you're also a teacher on top of that. So you're kind of operating in this field that is intradisciplinary. It contains like all of these different disciplines. And because of that, it can be a little ill-defined. So you might look at the way that one person is being a naturalist, and that doesn't look like how you're being a naturalist. And that doesn't look like how this course on outdoor education taught you to be a naturalist. So there's a lot of different ways of being in this field. And that can create a lot of imposter syndrome. That can create a lot of doubt and confusion. And one thing that the consistent practice of nature journaling gave to these participants was the confidence to say, oh yeah, this is a thing that I do. I am a naturalist because I'm out there doing it every day. I'm participating in it. And it kind of built that identity up for them. So in addition to that, if we think about like the way that they look at the practices of science or understand the nature of science, as participants were using their field journal practice to build confidence in their identities as naturalists, the practices that they were doing while they were journaling became the things that they most readily associated with the practices of science. So like if they were taking lots of data, right, or they were doing a lot of measurement, those were things that they mentioned when they talked about like, what does a scientist do? I noticed that there were a lot of similarities between how do you describe what a scientist does and what do you do when you're nature journaling? And so the more that they were practicing it, the more that they could see themselves as true scientists, as people who are practicing science in a legitimate way. So I thought that was really cool. And then the last one that I'll leave you with is creating an identity as part of nature. This practice was really putting them in touch with their natural surroundings and helping them, morph that with their own identity in a way that showed them how they were connected with the more than human world and also very much a part of nature, and kind of blurred those lines. So those were the main findings that I had. It was very different than what I started out thinking it would look like. I was thinking, oh, I'm going to see like art mixed with science. How creative. But it really showed me how this practice was building a whole field, was creatively constructing, a culture around how we think about science and creatively constructing our understanding of science. And I'm going to leave it there because I really want to hear everybody else's thoughts, and I want to stop talking so I can listen to what you guys all have in reflecting on that info. Oh, Billy Joe.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on the screen. I wanted to sort of come back to the identity part. Some of the things that within my school board that we're looking at is Black student success strategies, and Indigenous success strategies as well, and having students see themselves in their own work and making that in a more sort of inclusive space, and letting them sort of be the center of their own work. And that's, sort of decolonization and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering if that is a part of your research, or if you sort of thought about that part of it as well, in terms of how are we able to integrate this into the classrooms or into other fields, to create a space where some people might not feel that it's a welcome space, but giving them the opportunity that it is a space that they are more than welcome in, and they can make it and connect it to their own lived experiences.
Thank you, Billy Joe. I didn't go there in this paper. I had a major page limit issue. I'm very loquacious, so
Yeah.
that is truly an issue for me. But I absolutely see that as integral to this work. I think that especially when you're looking at blurring those lines between nature and yourself, that is a major act of decolonization, because you are not owning or materializing what's around you. And in fact, I found that was, and I brought this up to my professor. So my professor, I will just throw this out there, is one of the researchers who created the participatory framework for creativity, and I made a major critique of it, which is that it really looks at how the material world pushes up against your work, right? So if you're a painter, you have some confines with the paint. The type of paint you're using is going to kind of push up against your work and limit you in certain ways, or create certain affordances, right? And when you're nature journaling, you're outside, there's the elements, there's all sorts of things to consider. And so the natural world pushes up against your work. But one of the critiques that I launched, and I think this also gets at what you're talking about with decolonization, is that I actually think when you're talking about the material world pushing up against your work, it doesn't have intention, right? Like the paint doesn't intend to be a certain way, it just is. But I don't think that's true of nature. So I actually think that there is intention that's exerted from the natural world, and that's very anti-colonialist mindset of understanding the more than human world as having its own intention and exerting a force in this world, because we really think that we are the only beings that get to have intention. But I think that there's also power in that for students who are in maybe marginalized communities and things, that you don't have to be in the place that people put you in. Nature doesn't have to be in the box that we put it in, right? We can kind of blur the lines and push outside of those boundaries.
Yeah, and I was thinking that the same thing even with the confidence piece, right? Like I see a even when I nature journal here with students, it's very, when they come to the field centers, it's like, whoa, because they're very urban, right? And so getting them sort of out of that constraint is one thing, but then, having like, I don't know how to say it without saying it wrong, but how society is sort of, labeled or made it uncomfortable for certain cultures to feel welcome into the environment, right? And so we see that a lot with Black students and things like that. And so I always feel like, we've been talking a lot about nature journaling being maybe one of those things that sort of, not bridges the gap, but gives a place for students to enjoy it and to experience it, and then to put themselves into that space. And because it's science and art, but creativity in your own way, that you can make those connections to your own lived experience and your own spaces. And then hopefully sort of building that confidence. This is a place that I can be, and this is a place I should be, and this is a place that I am welcome in, right? So it's interesting to sort of see your research, and then, sort of connect it to what's going on sort of within our school board, and how we're sort of using, how can we, bridge those gaps, and sort of break it down, and sort of get it out there, with different ways. So I was just curious if you had thought about that, or potentially an upcoming research.
Potentially an upcoming research for sure. And
Yeah.
I think one thing that's really interesting, and I work with students in Oakland, and I think what you're saying about just being welcome in different spaces, I think about like the experience that I had as a kid, climbing over fences and backyards and exploring nature without being fearful of
Mhm.
anyone thinking that I was trying to break into their home or harm their property or posing a threat of any kind. And I get to do that because I have the privilege of having
Yeah.
this color skin and this space. And so when I'm working with my students, it occurred to me, like, we were out, and they were climbing trees and they got yelled at by somebody, and they don't look like me, and I think that they were under a lot of suspicion about what they were doing and how they were being in
Mhm.
the natural world.
Yeah.
And I do think that having a journal in some ways can be somewhat of a safety net for them, to say, like, and it shouldn't be this way. I'm not saying that this
100%.
is, like, ideal, but I've heard from, black birders and things like that. Like, have your binoculars out, have your gear out and apparent to people as a way to protect yourself of, like, I am out here making observations of nature. I am not up to no good or
Mhm.
whatever.
And
And
I
just
think also being able to give them a space to write those feelings into that journal as well, which I think is a really, um, a precious part of nature journaling too, that I think sometimes we sort of forget, or we don't really add in, but is that emotional piece to it as well, of like, what was my experience today, or I did meet somebody really awesome, or I was, made to feel welcome this experience, and maybe how it was, it reminds me of another time when I was somewhere else and it wasn't like that, right? And so I wonder, about building that confidence in their, not only in their science and their nature and the creativity, but hopefully building confidence in owning a space, that they can be in as well. So yeah, just some interesting thoughts. But I don't want to take up the whole time, but I just want to sort of, throw it out there.
no, thank you for bringing
Yeah.
that up. That's
Thanks,
so important.
Lindy. Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for everything. This has been a really amazing presentation. Like, you really did a great job. So thank you.
Yeah. Hey,
And I just want to back up what Billy Joe is saying. This is really, really exciting. And to have this kind of thought and scholarship starting to kind of engage with this area is a game changer. This whole idea of yeah, the journal as part of the safety net. Like, no, I'm birding, I'm doing nature study, to give people the alternate label, other as, no, you're a black person loafing, handing, that, like, there's this whole other narrative of and assumptions that come along. And so there's an artifact that gives people a different point of reference. I've never thought of any of this. Kate, what is bouncing around in your head right now? This is so cool. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to bounce right off of that same sort of thing. Talking about identity, is that, I've found personally, like, if I'm as a woman who likes to hike by herself, having a nature journal, and especially like, and I wear, the big goofy hat, and I have the hiking backpack, and I do the whole thing, and people think that I work there. They like think that I'm, I've had people be like, oh, so you must be with like DLNR or something. And so yeah, and so I can imagine for people of other minority identities, I hope that they would be able to, it's kind of an interesting thing. And I, the lots of different ways of being, it also helps, I think of neurodiversity as well, is that because there are, like, nature journaling provides all these different like avenues towards an identity of a naturalist or a scientist. I'm somebody who's really struggled with the terminology of science and the vocabulary of it. That was something that we actually talked about in our breakout room about the science and art. I also never really felt like a true artist because I struggled with the language of, fine arts practice, and same thing, fine, rigorous academia can be really intimidating to some people. And so, but when I'm sitting there working in my journal and I'm identifying species and behaviors and, developmental milestones in different birds and things that I'm, interactions between, different plants. And, then I suddenly go like, wait, I do know a lot and I am capable and I am creating something, artistic and scientific. And, and so, I just see a lot of value and like you putting it out there too in this very rigorous format of saying like, this is helping with identity. And that is important, it is helping people, identify and create culture and, be a part of all of that. So yeah, so thank you so much for your work. And yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, that was something that also, it was a little bit surprising to me how impactful it was to identity formation. Like I knew that it was a part of our lives and we can think about it like, but it wasn't like I was looking for people to be like, I identify as a nature journaler and that's my identity. It wasn't like that, but it was so impactful in building how they thought about themselves as practicing science. And that can be a really gated, like you said, and art as well can feel really gated and, like it's for a select few of highly creative, highly talented people. And really we know that everything is a practice, that everything is cumulative. And even when we come together in a community, we are able to accomplish so much more than we are on our own. And that's not because we're not enough on our own. That's because that's how community works,
So that community accepts you. So there's a couple just crazy points. This is radically cool. This is radically cool. Like, so let's just take what Kate was saying about how like the label, the scientists, the artists, those are things that maybe I don't see myself as. But now I'm over here, I'm doing this nature journaling thing, and the nature journal page, it just starts to collect, there's that observation, that observation, that observation, that observation. And on the next day, I'm going to get this and this and this and this and this connection, and then these questions. And then I'm doing this, it's happening on the page. And there's this emergent property that happens with nature journaling when we get all these different things down on the page. Out of that comes connections and an understanding and a relationship that we couldn't get to just inside our electric meat. So then having that helps me be able to take on that mantle or that identity. But then there's this other idea that the community is then coming together and reinforcing that identity. Like, oh yeah, look at that piece of paper. Yeah, this is what we're talking about. And it gives you this objective thing to pick up and hold. This is.
Yeah. And I think like when you see science as something so separate, like I couldn't be a scientist because I'm not at, Watson and Crick's level of intellect and creativity and whatever you say about it.
And Rosalind Franklin.
When you put up that wall, I think it also obscures what science really is. Because then you think, well, science is only a process that can happen in a lab, that can happen with this special equipment, that can happen, when this highly intelligent person has this aha moment and it's very special. And it's not, this more like nebulous, growing, changing, evolving process which truly science is. But I mean, I didn't see myself as a scientist for maybe ever. Maybe ever. I don't know. It's still a work in progress, I would say. It's hard because we get this like kind of classic interpretation handed down to us pretty early on, at least in my formal schooling, of these kind of geniuses that it just seems unobtainable. But it creates a very ill-formed idea of what science actually is. And so if I think it's just geniuses that, had this idea and then they created this fact, then there's no room for my voice in that. There's no room for, for me to push up against that. Who am I to say? And so it kind of creates this gate around all of it. And I think the same thing happens in the art world, as Kate was mentioning. And it really damps down our potential for contributing when, like, really these small everyday little movements, this everyday practice, this one question that you have that you write down and share with someone, that's what makes the field of science work. That's what makes artwork as well. The small little tweaks that we make, and then the sharing and community.
So there's this process, and there's a really low bar to entry into that process, and the process is the genius. There's a genius in that process. And so if you do the process, you are the process, you become the process. That genius is delivered to you because you are doing it, and you are looking for evidence, and you're making relationships, and you are deliberately employing your curiosity. And the process of that, the things that are happening on that piece of paper, it makes that's where all these threads come together in a way that our brain cannot handle on its own. But if you do that process, the genius of that process then is yours.
Yeah, I like how you said, that our brain can't handle on our own, because even when I think about like, writing something down in your journal, maybe capturing a specific thing, you might not be ready that day for the discovery that could come from that. But in 3 years and much more knowledge later, you may return to that exact same page and see something totally different. You might return to the same page and say, oh, I was noticing, 50 birds a day in my backyard, and today I'm noticing 20 birds a day. And now that actually is something really important that needs to be reported. But I never knew that my noticing of 50 birds was important at all on the day that I recorded it. I didn't know that until it was put in this longer temporal context. There's just so much stuff that can happen between the first time that you make that page and the revisitation. That can really, you can be in community with yourself in some ways, and like really say like, like I actually was doing things this way, and now I'm doing things that way, and I've noticed, how it changed in this certain way that leads me to a new discovery.
Ooh, so you're not just seeing change in the physical world around you, you're seeing that change inside yourself. I wasn't even asking these sort of questions before. And yeah, our brain can't handle the change on its own. Our brain can't handle complexity on its own. And it's hard for us to, in order to draw relationships between things, I need to hold all this stuff in my brain and all this stuff in my brain and bring those together. But if they're there on the paper, and all I have to do is circle this and draw a line over to this over there, that brain is that the adjunct of the journal to our cognition allows us to do so much more. And then I just want to tag back into this idea that you have. I love this, like this, how we're constructing this identity, but we're doing that within this community. And then what is the impact of just kind of looking through somebody else's journal pages and sort of see them thinking and like, oh yeah, it's reinforcing that those strategies that are the genius. I want to hear from more voices. I kind of cut you off there. You're about to say something, but I also want to encourage more people in this community who are listening. What is this sparking in your mind? I'm feeling really excited. But please, what were you about to say, Lindy?
Oh, I was actually just reading the chat, and so it's probably like talking as I was reading, but I was thinking about what Yvette was saying, witnessing how other people react and how like reinforcing that can be as well. And just like understanding, oh, like they're seeing my work as something interesting. Maybe I can re-examine my work through their perspective and see it as even more interesting than I ever thought my own work could be. I'm actually having that experience right now. Like, presenting work and just hearing other people's reactions to it, interpretations of it, and that can really push you forward in the work as well.
Like in the movies, if they show you something sad, we don't get responded to that. But our mirror neurons come in if they show you the reaction shot where this is a sad scene. Here's a picture of somebody being sad, a little tear, right? And then we human beings go like, oh, or a little mirror neurons kind of go like, that person's sad, I'm sad, and now we're sad. I think we really underestimate the power of our reactions to people's stuff. So what Yvette is saying, like if the person looks at it and goes like, oh, that's nice, and let's bounce over there, and I'm going to just get effusive about this one that's a pretty picture. Right?
Yeah. And I think like when I originally conceptualized of like creativity on the page of the nature journal, I know I wasn't thinking pretty picture because like, as a teacher, I mean, I was first going to do this actually with students, and then I didn't get IRB approval in time. So I flexed to do adults. But my first conception was kind of this like art, like a classic interpretation of art mixed with science, right? And I think what I really found is that you could look at what you're doing, just making the most basic page of nature journaling ever. You might walk outside, see a thing that you want to journal about, draw literally half a leaf, get disrupted by something, and then leave, and you have your half a leaf. And that might spark something that it doesn't really matter, but the practice, that the tiniest, most seemingly insignificant mark that you make counts as creativity. It counts because it is just reinforcing the practice. Like, oh, I tried to do that this morning and I found out I didn't have enough time, whatever it is. But all those tiny moments count as creativity. And I think that's important, just as a takeaway, like that I learned.
So I'm seeing that you're right. The chat is blowing up, but I'm also noticed that Yvette, if you feel comfortable sort of sharing in discourse form some of the ideas you've been putting in chat, you've been just I've really enjoyed seeing some of your thoughts and reflections on this. Is it going to bring you in on that? I'm going to add you into the spotlight.
I'm not sure what I said, but okay. No, I was responding to some really awesome questions and thoughts in the chat. Like we were talking a bit about finding community and people that you relate to and stuff, and then we were talking about self-consciousness and like trying to find our like, do we feel on the same level? And so then you were talking about reactions, and then also about different I think that Lydia was mentioning about definitions of what nature drilling is or what artists are, and so that was an interesting thing there. And sorry, there's just so much going on in the chat that I'm trying to figure out how to summarize what I'm reading. Let's see here.
And is those labels just sort of such an interesting thing, like to say I'm a scientist takes hubris, but it's a different thing to realize when you look down at your journal and you see that it is science.
Yeah. Really
I'm
good.
a little bit curious if folks kind of revisit whatever you wrote down as your definition of creativity in the very beginning. Do you feel like that is still the whole potato, or do you feel like you would add to it after experiencing this conversation, or change it, or anything? I see Eleni's hands up too.
Oh,
wow, my head's blowing up too. So I will try to focus myself and respond to Lindy's most recent question, to return back to the original question: how are art and science similar and different? And I had a wonderful discussion with Brian Cox. I was happy to meet him today in our little breakout group. My perspective, the more and more I think about it, is that art and science are not different at all. They're just not. They both involve looking at how things work, whether it's outside oneself or manipulating a paintbrush, and how does it work and how does the color work. And they also involve expressing yourself. I mean, why did Einstein choose to study what he studied? He was passionate about it. He talked about it as poetry. So that creates a dilemma. If they're the same on some very deep philosophical level, why do we keep talking about them and differentiating them? That's important too, because they are different. And some of those differences are embodied in our educational system. And I'll get on a soapbox, just a little teeny tiny soapbox. I think that part of our is K through 12 schooling that makes these things, like science is this, writing is that, and art is that. Happily, there are so many homeschooling folks and non-traditional teaching that breaks it all down. So then what do we do with that? We still have language. We still do want to make distinctions between things. Those distinctions are useful, and they're in a social context where we have people of different backgrounds and experiences. And so in order for me not to sort of get totally overwhelmed, I sort of take this question and say, okay, how does this question come alive in the smaller universe where I find myself or connect myself, and how does that issue surface there? So I teach a nature journaling class in an art center. And I'm a pretty gentle, friendly kind of girl in the class. I'm not heavy-handed, but I do insist in my own jolly way. What do you notice? What are you curious about? What does it remind you of? And I can beat my head against the wall all day long, and they're still looking over each other's shoulders and saying, oh, you know how to draw that, and I suck. So that's the kind of issue I'm really dealing with in a very loving and gentle way. And I'll just stop by giving one example that maybe folks have heard before. So I always invite people to talk about their own work, and I really gently discourage as people get to know me, they play along. I really discourage people making any comments about anybody else's work. End of story. You can ask a question about another, like if you have a question and the artist or the journaler is open to receiving a question, they can say, no, I just want you all to witness this. It's very counterintuitive to the art world and the teaching world, but it gives people privacy and they can create and share optionally. Anyway, I think you get the idea, and that creates a really safe space for people to find themselves authentically in a space. Oh, I didn't know I was an artist, and now I feel safe because I'm drawing what I want. And the art is amazing. Anyway, I'll put a pause there, but that's kind of how I take all of these amazingly complex, brilliant ideas and sort of sift them within the past hour. How is it going to come alive for me? Well, I'm going to insist in my own ornery way that art and science are very similar, but now you've given me more language to understand how they are similar.
I think you're bringing up a really good point in creativity, which is like the idea of creating, of putting something new out into the world, right? That is a very vulnerable place to be in. And so there is a necessity for, creating, if you're a teacher, psychological safety in the learning community so that people feel like they can put something new out there, because that can be a really scary place, to put something that's it totally feels like your own. I think after today's talk, we all know that we all shared in the process in some way, or our history or our culture has all shared in shaping that process. But truly, there is a moment as the individual where you're doing something new or, testing something out. And it is a very vulnerable position to be in.
Can I just piggyback on that for 1 second? 'Cause I just love that, Lindi. And I think language and reframing can really be helpful here. Because what's new to me is like so familiar to you. And if we can, I want to honor the joy, when my 6-year-old great nephew says, oh my God, this thing works in this way. I just want to share in that joy and not say, oh, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
In fact,
I feel that really, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like,
Sorry,
when
go
I
ahead.
was in it was 7th grade, and we had to do a book report. I think some of you may have heard the story, and we had book reports on fiction books and nonfiction books, and I found this nonfiction book in the basement about color, and oh my God, they're like 3 colors, and you can mix them and get all the other colors. So I wrote my nonfiction book review about colors, and the teacher basically, I don't remember literally what my teacher said. I remember his name, but I won't say it here. He should live and be well. It was basically like ho hum. Everybody knows that, ho hum. I put down my paintbrush in 7th grade and I did not pick it up for, it's insane, 30 years. Crazy, crazy stuff. So how do we honor the enthusiasm of the person for whom it is new? They never traced a leaf before. They didn't realize you could actually put the leaf on the paper and trace it, and that's okay, and it's not cheating.
Yeah. And I think like understanding that for them in that moment, that is an act of creation. And not only that, but you as their teacher in community with them, because you're seeing them do something new, put themselves out there, be vulnerable. You're reflecting on the prompt that gave that made them feel safe enough to do that, and how you could use that in future classes or share it with your community of educators. And so that moment, you're creating the field, like you and that student together are actually like creating a moment together that influences future moments for future students, for you as a teacher, for them as an artist. So that really builds up their trajectory of work as well.
Vea, what's bouncing around in your head as you're thinking about these sorts of ideas.
When we were talking just now about creativity, and when Eleni was saying about and what we were saying about creating the space where kids can be that creative, it reminded me of an earlier thing we were discussing a bit in the chat about giving people permission to be uncomfortable in nature. And so then and then I'm thinking it's the same way with art too, about letting people be uncomfortable in spaces. But then also I've been considering whether there's a different price for being uncomfortable depending on what community you come from and what your background might be. And so if that's the case, it might help as educators to be aware of what some of those different prices might be, and then think about ways to show safety with regard to certain of those things, so that way people can see where being uncomfortable won't have such a high price. That's just a thing that had come into my mind. And then also, Eleni, when you were mentioning the 3 colors, I was going to make a joke until I realized that I was kind of demonstrating what we've been talking about. And the joke was going to be, well, you know, the club secret password, what are the 3 primary colors? Is it red or is it magenta? And then I was like, but then suppose that somebody was like coming in and like, no, it's red. And are we going to make them uncomfortable by saying, no, you're wrong, it's magenta? Because no, then they're going to feel kind of shut off. Or we can say, well, a lot of us here, including our friend here, Jack, really strongly believes that it's magenta, but he can enthusiastically listen and discuss with you why it might or might not be red or magenta. But the thing is to show that we can enthusiastically discuss and listen to each other. And so as a result, it's not like some secret club thing where if you believe in red and not magenta, then it's, you know, shun the non-believer. That's from Charlie the Unicorn. Sorry about the. Anyways, so the thing is that it's
Love
like
Charlie the Unicorn.
and I'm remembering, and I'm saying that because the first time I ever went to one of Jack's classes was in fact about the color wheel, and the knowledge and like learning from Jack that, you know, about the CYMK with the printers, and learning that it was and I didn't I didn't feel dumb, even though I'd never known that before. I felt excited. And so being able to like be sort of like, this is a thing that we can do. I also, Jack had me at, but wait, there's more. And so being able to convey that enthusiasm to people, because that was my first time hearing that, instead of, you know, oh, well, you didn't know that, you're not in our secret club. I didn't feel that. So it's important to remember that it's like what you said, it's their first time.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because in 7th grade, I had that wow moment. And then whenever it was, maybe 5 or 8 years ago, when I learned that there was actually another color system that had to do with computers and light coming the other way. And my husband in academic publishing, who's always trying to print art books, and suddenly with CYM, oh my God, there's actually 2 different universes of color wheels. And then you go in, you fall down that rabbit hole, and you find there's even more than 2. So it gets more exciting. And that's science, right? I mean, that's science and art right there. You could study color for an entire lifetime.
This is.
So I think that's where it decreases conflict, right? If you say, well, red is primary in that system, in that paradigm, and magenta is in that paradigm, and it sort of it takes away from, you know, oh, it's this, it's that, and then conflict evaporates when you realize you're operating in different paradigms or different universes, different ways of thinking. And then that brings people together. Like, you know, we can acknowledge that we're coming from different spaces or places, and it's not a goal to smush them all together to be one thing.
Let's bring Sarah in on this conversation. Sarah, what has this got you thinking about?
Oh, blimey, so much. I mean, just thank you again. It's my second only session already. My mind has been blown so many times. Thank you so much, Lindy, for everything that you've done. It's food for thought. I'm taking everything that I'm learning from these sessions into my practice as a teacher, and I'm finding the whole experience so much more rewarding than just the teacher-student relationship. That I'm learning so much. I'm changing my language. I'm relaxing a lot more into the role of not necessarily being a leader, like in charge of health and safety, but more like a fellow explorer, sharing that joy, sharing those discoveries, and then together discovering all the different strategies for trying to capture that and communicate that. So thank you so much. I mean, yeah, it's wonderful. I just wanted to share with you one example that I had in a bit of feedback, in that I consider, when we're talking about identity, I proudly identify as a geek, and I have done for, yes, for 30 years. And I don't know whether that sits firmly within art or science. Yeah, totally. For me, the two are perfectly blended. We were talking about this purely by coincidence this morning out on a walk. I was doing one of my sessions, and we all agreed that art and science are essentially the same, and it is actually the formal education system that tries to get it process driven, to kind of drill it down into a process that is repeatable, and that's for both science and art. Anyway, I digress. My example that I had from a member of a group was a little parasitic plant called toothwort that I'd read about a day before a session, and I'd gone out to a beautiful place near me called Wenlock Edge. It's limestone, Google it, it's absolutely gorgeous. And there are only 10 records on this hill of toothwort. And I was determined to find it. And I took the group out with me, and I said, look, I need to see this for myself. I need to discover it. And so we went out there, and almost as we were heading back to the car, it was absolutely pouring down with rain. And I found it after I'd fallen over, and I put my hand out to steady myself, and I was on eye level with this thing, and I made this noise that I couldn't, it was like primeval, this total joy. And people came rushing over, and I was able to share this toothwort, which is no more than maybe 5-10 centimeters tall, perfectly white and ghost-like, emerging underneath the leaf litter. And we all just kind of, it was too wet to draw it, too dark to photograph it, but the excitement that I had at going on that short journey to get interested and curious about something, and then to see it, was infectious to all other members of the group. Now, fast forward 6 months, we're sitting there today, and I haven't seen this lady for maybe 3 or 4 months. And she went, oh, I went on a break, and I went down to a completely different part of the UK, and I saw toothwort, and I remembered it, and it was drilled into my brain, and I made the same noise as you, and all my friends were excited, and they gathered around, and now they're going off and telling their friends to go and look for toothwort, and they might tell their friends, and they might tell their friends, and so on and so forth. And that's why you kind of feel like the center of a wheel. Going back to what we do really, really matters. And it's our enthusiasm and our role modeling and our confidence to just be unashamedly joyful every time we do it, I think is really important. So that for me is kind of the essence of creativity, is a bit of a joy, bit of process, bit of learning. And I'll stop there, but thank you. Yeah, look it up, look up toothwort. Well,
I think we also need to learn that sound. If we could all learn that sound, and
I couldn't recreate it.
We could spread toothwort joy everywhere. Oh, that is.
You have to be there. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it again.
No, yeah, it has. We have to pop one up in front of you.
Yeah, it's like primary.
Record that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I couldn't even spell it. I can't put it in chat either. I think it begins with a B, but not swearing. Yeah, I can remember the noise, but anyway, yeah. But thank you for letting me share. I appreciate that, and I yeah, I've learned again so much.
Also, just the idea of the joy in this, and which takes us back to the role of community in this, and in this creative process. How interesting, how beautiful. Hey. Looking at the clock, I think we're close to our wrap-up time, but this discussion is far from over. I think that as we kind of are defining art and science, we would find room for some divergence. Probably there'll be several different views in this group, as it might be kind of a fun activity for us to kind of unwrap that can of, open that can of worms a little bit further open. sort of in my head, I can think of ways that I can, it's easier for me to put bounds around what science is and isn't than it is to put bounds around what art is and isn't. So in my brain, they start to feel more divergent, and but this and many other things I think are topics for further rich discussions with this group. I want everybody to kind of go over to your gallery view right now, and let's, if you can, turn on your screen and just send big hearts and thank you to Lindi for this work, this insight. This is really, really important, and you got us thinking about ideas. Like you really went down on a rabbit hole, and then you were able to gift wrap that for us and open that and open that box for us. It was just to put as many metaphors as I can into one sentence. I'm so excited.
Thank you. Thank you guys for listening. I really tried to take a paper that went in many directions and like make it very concise. I don't know how successful I was at that, but I'm so glad that y'all got something out of it, and thank you for listening.
This is wonderful. We're so grateful to you. I also want to thank my two amazing co-hosts, Billy Joe Reed and Vea Moore. You are incredible, and thank you so much for what you do to nurture and support this community. Thank you to all of the educators who are have joined us and share your thoughts, your ideas, and inspiration. As we are, we are as a community, as a group, we are redefining what are the best practices in nature journaling and nature journaling education. And this is a work in progress, and you are constructing that with us. It is, I'm so thankful to be, when we're kind of thinking about this kind of the way that this community is kind of actively involved in generating these practices, our identity, our confidence. I think we see kind of another kind of reflection of the processes that you're talking about in your paper. And thank you all so much. I look forward to continuing to evolve with all of you, and more shenanigans to come. Again, Lindi, we're so grateful. And everybody, just let's take home from this that this world is richer, more complex, more nuanced, and more wonderful than we imagined. And if I put on my science hat, I think I've gotten a little bit closer to understanding what is going on here, still knowing that I am not there yet. And that's a wonderful place to be. Let's continue this insight, this rigor, and this the joy, as Sarah was suggesting us, the importance of the joy in this process. Let us be conduits for sharing that around the globe. Thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, everyone.